right? We didn't even know it was this week. Then I saw it. I'm like, oh, okay, it's this week. So
Even better, we're going to have a real conversation.
real conversation then, yeah.
Great. So well, just real quick, I wanted to announce one thing because we have some news, exciting news this week. We've actually extended M&A Science with a new line called M&A Science Academy, which we're starting to pre-market. If you go to the website, I'll post a link on chat here too. But if you go to the website, mascience.com, you'll be able to learn more about this new academy program that we've put out there, which we've got about 20, I think we're up to 25 instructors. Even Ajit, we talked about it, but getting a variety of instructors that are going to be teaching workshops covering a whole variety of different M&A topics that's going to be available. It's going to be a subscription behind it so that it gives you unlimited access to all this content. But that was the biggest feedback I received from podcast listeners and our conference attendees. People want to know the how-tos of M&A. So we're actually working and putting it together and are going to start producing these content coming in November. And that's about it. You ready to go?
Yeah, let's go.
All right.
Unless you ask, the question was for somebody else.
No, that was it. I just got to put it out there. I got to check my marketing plugs, and that's the only one I had was new M&A Science Academy, and tell people to check it out. But yeah, fun project. It's keeping us busy. We have a press release going out tomorrow about it too. But with that, I'm your host, Kisan Patel, CEO and founder. Today, I'm here with Ajit Sane, Director IT M&A at Agilent Technologies. Ajit is an M&A professional with multiple years of experience in leading acquisitions, integrations, and divestitures. He's led dozens of acquisitions, joint ventures, divestitures, end to end, from diligence, go-to-market strategies, integration planning, execution, customer partner migration, and operational transition. Today, we're going to talk about how to wind a business down with minimal customer and people disruption. How are you today, Ajit?
Pretty good. Thanks. Thanks for having me, Kisan. Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you. Can we kick off with just a brief overview of your experience with wind downs?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you thanks for the intro as well. As you said, I've been doing M&A for a while now, and just like a lot of M&A professionals, I've been doing the divestitures as part of it as well. But wind down is something that just came, and an opportunity came to me. Actually, a couple of them came to me recently, and it's something that I try to figure out how is it different, than let's say a divestiture or something else. And wind down is a little different. It's not a divestiture. It's something like, for example, the business unit, or maybe it's a product line that's there in a company. It has its own P&L. And for multiple of reasons, there is a need maybe from the long-term strategy for the company to wind down the business. So we are not divesting it, we are not selling it. It's no carve out, but it has a bunch of customers. Maybe it has some products. In some cases, depending on the vertical, there are some manufacturing implications. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. It has a whole gamut of things that you got to take in account. Customers being one, got to be very careful when you're calling a customer and telling them that, hey, thanks for buying stuff from us, but we are probably shut down specific product and the services that go along with it. And so it's kind of in an analogy, it's a disassembling, like do-it-yourself furniture. You're disassembling it, but has to be done in the right order. So yeah, it's been quite an experience.
So it's not as simple as just turning the off switch and cutting it out. It seems like there's more things to navigate and just sensitivity around it.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I wish it was that simple, right? But I think the day and age we live in, there are a lot of things to factor in. The sensitivity, as you talked about, around the employees, right? That's number one. You have to really figure out what it means, for the employees who are specifically working on that business unit or the product line. Then there are things around the customers. How do you make sure the customers are in the right place? You transition them off to another vendor or another product, or if better yet, if you have something else for them to take a look at. And then there are things around the contractual obligations, manufacturing implications, the sites, the legal entity. I mean, you name it. It's basically like running an M&A, but in a reverse order.
Well,
So there are a lot of things to look at.
what are some reasons a company would do a wind down?
Yeah, it's a good question. Depends on a lot of things, I guess. Important thing is what is that business unit or the product line, or what are we trying to wind down? And is it specifically to do with the, let's say you did an acquisition and the acquisition didn't work out, right? And you tried everything. You had tried to pivot the solution or the product or the service, or you try to bundle it with the existing product that you have. Maybe there is a change in market environment. There is a decline in revenue. You try to figure out any course correction that you can do, right? And maybe that just didn't go through. Maybe there is a complete switch in the company priorities, right? Company probably, or the corporation which is doing that specific wind down, they were doing they want to go and do completely different, off tangent, and whatever they have, it makes sense for them to focus the resources in the right place, right? So that could be another reason. So there are several reasons, right? I think at the end of the day, as a CEO of a company, CFO of a company, you got to really bite the bullet at some point and figure out what their goals are for 3 to 5 years, and how do you then make sure all the resources that you need are used in the right way, especially if the specific business unit is bleeding cash, right? And we tried several ways to try and course correct and didn't go through. That's the reason. And in many cases, you would see a divestiture, but you try and see if that's possible. If not, then you're left with really little options but to wind down.
So ultimately, you got a business line that's not profitable, and that you may explore divestitures prior to looking at winding the business down. And even with that, there's factors that sort of drive that business line to be unprofitable, be it changes in markets, regulations, et cetera. And that sort of seems to be the main drivers for ultimately coming down and saying, hey, let's just wind this business down. There's really nothing else we could do.
Right, exactly. And I mean, all I'll just add to it is, I think from my experience so far, it's a tough decision, right? And there are implications all around. And you don't want to go out to the market and also say that you're going to stop something. So all of the above that you just said, once you figure out nothing of the above is going to work out, then you basically have to do the wind down. Yeah.
Got it. How should you approach a wind down in terms of planning?
Yeah. So I think, as I mentioned, there is when this a couple of opportunities for me to lead came up, and I went around and looked at all the, being in the industry, I know all the experts, right, from an M&A perspective, or at least I think I do, but the Deloittes of the world and all the management firms out there, there is no playbook that you will find for a wind down, is what I quickly realized. So there isn't a playbook. So there is we are basically trying to decouple a business unit or what have you, that what may the case might be. So it's like any planning exercise, right? It's really, really important to identify the critical path, right? So what's the critical path? Once you know what the scope of the wind down is, what's the critical path for us to go there, right? It could be several things. It could be customer obligations. You might have sales contracts with customers, which basically won't just allow you to just say, well, this is the date and we're going to wind down. That could be one reason. There could be reasons around there is end of sale, end of life restrictions on the contractual documents, right, that you have with the customers. And again, I emphasize on the customer here is, I think it depends on the customer too. If you are talking about, let's say, a software company who's trying to do a wind down, I'm not trivializing software in any way or shape or form, but I think it's not as compared to, let's say, you're trying to wind down a business in a life science or a pharmaceutical company, right, as a customer, because there are clinical trials that customers are running, and they have as you can imagine, millions and millions of dollars invested in the R&D, and there is a reason why what they're doing, and you can't just pull off from there. And that's why you have this contractual contracts, right? The legal documents, which will make sure that you have to really carefully look at. Then there are, there are also, in some cases, depending on the scope and where the employees and the manufacturing sites and the legal entities are, you got to look at the labor laws, right? The employment laws and labor laws, which are very country and state specific. Maybe if I might just say, things are a little different in Europe versus Asia as opposed to United States, right? So there are those things that you need to take a careful view on as to what makes sense, what is our, the critical path on each of them. There are other things which probably fall in line. There are regulatory or data archival things that you need to take a look at. How long do we need to keep the data? Is there any IP that is involved in intellectual property that's there that we need to harvest and keep it for some other reason, right? So what does that mean? There are financial benefits. I mean, the CFOs of the company will definitely want to weigh in and say, well, if you do it this way, there are some benefits to be had. And so I think the finance team does have a big say. And last but not the least, I'm sure, I mean, those are not really critical, but the system changes, right? I mean, a simple example, depends on how integrated this product line or the business unit is with your corporate systems and your corporate architecture, right? So if it does mean that you have to do something specifically where you have to have a product release or a software release, right? So those things have to be accounted for, and there are quarterly releases and monthly releases, and I have an IT background, so I know that plays heavily in some of those timelines. So those are like the factors that you would really think about when you talk about in terms of planning, right? When you sit at the table and think about, okay, so what does it mean? How soon, how fast can I do this? And what implications we have. So I think it depends is really the broad answer if you consider all those factors.
Yeah, it's interesting because it sounds like a lot of it depends on ongoing obligations. You used the example of your customer agreements where you may have some specific clauses or terms in there that really obligate you to provide some extended, prolonged service commitments. You mentioned employment labor laws because everybody's a big fan of the EU labor laws, in different European countries and so forth that may hold you obligated if you, in terms of some sort of incentives for the staff that you're letting go and things like that. And then I think archiving is another general one. So yeah, it's interesting how a lot of the planning, it's actually not so much of a, here's a task list or like you mentioned, the playbook just to go down, but it's a little bit more, what are actually the ongoing obligations and planning around it? Is there a certain approach when it comes to prioritizing that? Like, is there certain things that, hey, let's really focus on the customer aspects first, or how would you just prioritize some of those factors you mentioned?
Yeah, I think great question. I think depends on those things I think we talked about, right? So you need to figure out, I think in my case, in my examples, right, you need to figure out what's that long pole, in the tent. Right? This is really if this happens, if I reach this milestone, then I think I'm good from there. I can really then execute on my plan. So I think the prioritization of it is really dependent on, let's say, doing a contract review of all the customer contracts as an example, and you find there is a clause in there that customers would need 12 months notice before you can tell them that you're not going to sell them this product or this service. So that then becomes immediately your 12 months, ticker, right? So you know that if I do it now, I need to keep everything going for 12 months. I need to keep my R&D going, my production going, my support, everything needs to go and keep clicking then. There might be another case where, let's say we talked about the labor unions, right, in some countries and some states even. Where in that case where you have to really think about, okay, so what are those timelines? What are the documents? What are the things I need to bring to the table to satisfy what they need from their perspective. So that's a big thing too. And you got to go do good with your customers. You got to do good with your employees at the end of the day. Because I think in this case, it's not shutting down the entire business. When the wind down we're talking in this context is about a specific business unit, a specific product line, which entails that your company is still there. You're still selling products, still selling services, but not in that space. So you still are going to have some of those customers come and buy your products, other products, right? So there is that overlap. So those kind of decisions, again, I mean, I wish I could just say that these are the priorities, but it depends on so many factors, right? And which makes it much interesting, I think, as a project, like overall as well.
Well, this is good. I'm looking forward to getting into the part about how do you avoid the actual friction because it sounds like there's an art form to that. But before we get into that, can we touch on what actual resources or functions do you need? I think a lot of us are familiar with the M&A process where you bring in a multitude of
Mhm.
operational functions and doing the deal. What does that look like from your lens when you're winding a business down?
Yeah, I mean, I'm again going to use the lens of our M&A, right? A normal IMO, integration management office that we set up for any deal or any acquisition that we are working on. I mean, same set of functions broadly, I think, are required, right? You'll have your sales and channel, you'll have your product marketing folks, you'll have HR for sure because there is going to be an impact on the employees one way or another. Then you also have your IT, you have your finance, legal, so a whole gamut of all the functions that you usually have when you are thinking of planning on doing acquisition integration, right? So those are all there. Again, it depends on, let's say in some cases there might be a wind down that you're doing which don't have customers yet. It's still an R&D, right? You're still doing product development, and then it becomes much easier. In that case, you don't need sales, you don't need you don't need your customer support and product marketing and all those things that are really after you are out there in the marketplace selling the product. So those are defined, by what the scope of it is. But you definitely need all those functions at the table. I think there is a little bit more difference between IMO and the functions that we bring in. And this one here is because I think in M&A, I would say it's more exciting. There is a little more excitement, right? That you are actually acquiring a company. There is excitement on the target. There's excitement on the acquirer. In this case, it's a little more not so excitement, right? And there are things that you got to be very careful about. So the thing that I'm trying to, as I'm drawing the parallels between normal M&A and wind down, in a M&A, I think you have much larger group of people working on it, as opposed to on a wind down, you want to really keep it at as really at the minimum that you can keep at, given the sensitivity behind the topic, and you have to have certain hurdles that you need to pass before you know that it's happening. So yeah, I mean, all the functions, as I said, are definitely needed. And then there might be one example which is very critical in this case, in my experience now, has been communication, right? So comms is there, but you usually tend to use your normal comms that you have for normal M&A project. But in this case, you need different kind of comms. You need comms that go to the market, to the industry, if it's a publicly traded company, right? There are comms that go to the employees. There are comms that go to the employees who are not affected. So you got to have that piece, which I quickly found out that we didn't have in one case, and had to go back and get some help in that regard to build the comms.
So structure, not as intense as integration, similar in terms of people you'll get involved from various functions, not as exciting because you're not acquiring, you're winding things down. I do have an interesting question that aligns with this. What is the last function that is shut down? Who turns the lights off as a business is being shuttered?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. So I think in one of the cases, I think the last function, if you may call that, is WPS, right? The workplace services function, right? And they are really the ones who are looking at it as and when they know that this is happening, and we propose them into the project. They're looking at it. Okay, so what does it mean if we are not going to use the facility? Like the site is also going to be wind down, or shut down, if you will. So what are we going to do, right? What's the lease on it? What are the terms on the lease? When you buy that site, are there any things that you put in there which now we need to disassemble again, right? There are things in there in case of, let's say, life sciences or a company, like Agilent, for where I work right now, right? In those cases, you have things like, applications and different huge devices that you need to then think about, okay, so where do I ship them? There are documentation. So usually it's the workplace services who are the last, tail end of who come back at the tail end of it and do a lot of work. But again, there is a legal entity discussions which we may get into later on, but that's a separate topic completely, right? So that legal entity has so many different cross-functional elements to it. So everybody is there, but one function, if you ask me, it's workplace services, who actually literally turn on the lights and the keys and we're done.
What are some of the other obstacles, challenges that you face?
There are actually a lot of challenges. Essentially, if you can plan as much as you can, right? But then there are things that you don't see ahead of time. And one classic example would be the pandemic situation we are in right now, right? I mean, like for everyone else, there are things that nobody has seen anything like this. And there are implications that come through it, right? There are HR implications, there are human implications, there are implications around, let's say you're doing a manufacturing build based on how much product you need to build, it at the upfront, but then suddenly the pandemic happens and nobody's allowed to go to work, right? So then all those plans go up in the air. So that's one. There are other implications you have to be very careful of. I mean, you can plan the best you can, but again, there are things which can go sideways, especially around PR, right? If you bad PR, there is something that you got to be really, really careful for, especially for publicly traded companies and for anybody, to be honest, but especially for companies, which are publicly traded, as well as they have to be careful about the implications that are going to be happening to the employees. There are shareholder implications. So as I said, you can plan for everything, but almost every time there is going to be something that's going to pop up. So you got to be very careful about it. And then the last is the legal. I mean, the legal aspect of it, I keep on harping up on it, but I think it's something that you got to have a strong legal team or advisor, especially because everything that goes out, every comm that goes out, everything that you're going to talk to the employees, the customers, has to be vetted out from legal perspective, and if not, that can have ramifications which we don't want to get into.
Have you seen that happen where all of a sudden there's just some post, close the bit line down, and then all of a sudden some legal issues come out of it?
Not to the effect of legal issues, but I have seen some things where, as I said earlier, right, you got to look at all the contracts. There are contracts not just with the customers, but you tend to have contracts with the vendors as well, right? And in a larger company, it depends on the company again, and depends on the vertical you are in. But as much as you are dependent on the vendors are dependent on you as well. So there are those implications that you got to be careful about. And if not, you might be surprised. I mean, to answer your question directly, there was a surprise that we did not account for because there was things that we did not know that popped up after we started talking to a vendor, and the vendor had a clause in there where we had to buy a certain amount of their product and services for 24 months. And that was quite a big of a number, right? So that just blew up the cost a little bit. But again, everything has a cost, right? So, but it does happen, things that you wouldn't expect, So But
The
again,
surprises are actually interesting because I feel like that's where you learn some intricate lessons that you're not going to learn otherwise from any book. But what other surprises have you come across when winding a business down?
um, other surprises, I would say. So you go down the list, right? For example, you're looking at, let's say, a set of employees who are really, really focused on that specific wind down or a specific product line. Obviously, the first thing we try to do is see if there are ways that we can have this, the skills of those employees can be used somewhere else. And that's number one. We try and do that, and we always, not always are we successful, unfortunately. But then you go down the path, and then suddenly it does come up that, oh, by the way, no, now we need this, right? We need this skill, we need this, and then that becomes another problem, right? Because once you announce about something, the train has left the station, so to speak, and then that has implications, especially in countries and states where you have very specific labor laws, right? You can't pick and choose, cherry pick, as an example, right? So, I mean, I can't go in more details around it, but I think that those are the things that I think have surprised me, that we have, as much as we think we have done the due diligence on it, there is always something that comes up, and you have to be just ready to pull up your sleeves and figure out a way out of it. So yeah, there is never a downtime in this kind of. It's very very in M&A. Another example, if I may draw, right, or a parallel, you do come across during when you're doing a merger, when you're doing an integration of an acquisition, you do come across uh, many times, I would say, that you set for a certain date for integration, complete integration, but you sometimes, that date never happens, and you postpone for whatever reason. In this case, there is that's not applicable, right? In a wind down, there are dates that you have to meet, so it's quite exciting in that sense, right? There is no room for error or margin for error. Um, but again, this kind of things that come up, you have to just be prepared. And as long as you have a very strong communication line with the executives uh, of the company, then you have good support from them.
When we wind a business down, we talked a little bit about some of the assets, but can we talk about the assets specifically that you're trying to protect and how you prioritize that?
Yeah. So when you talk about assets, there are several things, right? I think the biggest assets are really your employees, your customers, because I mean, really, I mean that's really the couple of big tenants. So I think those are the ones that you got to be very careful about. In the previous example, I said you're probably going to have the same customers buying other products and services from you. There are going to be distributors who are going to be buying products and services from you, and then they have their own obligations to their end customers. So the customer relationship, I think, is probably biggest assets, one of the biggest assets, if I may. So no matter, you look at all the customer contracts and you do all you can do to make sure you're okay from legal perspective, it all becomes a very critical part. When you talk to the customer, you got to be very, very open and honest, have a good communication material available with your sales folks on walking them through all the different steps and why we are doing what we are doing and how we're going to try and minimize that, right? So that's critical, right? So the customer relationship are very critical, I would say, no matter what industry you're talking about. There are also things like employees. You've got to have a solid plan for the employees. Try and see if there are ways where you can have them work on other areas within the company, and that's a constant dialogue between HR and different facets of the company, right? So that's one. There are other ones that I think are very critical, and those are IP, as an example, intellectual property. And when you're selling a product, the IP that goes along with it, that's very very important. And what happens with the IP? How do we make sure that it's set with the larger goals of the company, right? So you need to have your IP experts, you need to have your legal team. and figure out what does it look like, what does the IP look like after after we do this wind down. Do we keep the IP? Is there a possibility that we can use the IP somewhere else? Obviously, is there a way to monetize any of that? So there's a lot of things that can come up with IP, and even things where you need to keep the IP. You need to figure out what it means, in terms of the cost of keeping the IP, because they have some cost embedded in them. So it's a constant decision of looking at the pros and cons and figuring out what's best in the long term, right? In some cases, you just basically say, well, the IP is not what we think. That I mean, in some examples, you see that where there is a complete technology shift, a science shift in the industry, and the IP and the product that you have is probably not as valuable as it was. And you'll see this constantly in pharmaceuticals. You'll see that in many of those companies which have big manufacturing sites, and the IP suddenly is no longer as relevant, right? So then what does it mean? And then tax comes in, right? From what does it mean from write-downs perspective? What do we do from that point of view? So some of those are the kind of key assets that you got to be very mindful about. And then there are assets which you just have to write off. I mean, it's just something that you cannot do much about. There are assets, some big assets that you can try and see if we can disposition them and use it. Like for example, there are things like servers and all those things. Again, wearing my IT hat for a second, there are those things that they definitely can be recycled. So it becomes literally going down the list of inventory and seeing what can be recycled, what cannot be recycled, and so on and so forth. But the main ones you got to be careful about is the customer, the employees, the IP in general.
Got it. Sounds like those are the top priorities. I'm curious, what does the communication look like when we're talking about the customers, right? Because you sort of added like, hey, you do want to communicate this well because there could be ongoing relationship with other products and services they may be purchasing from your company, which makes a lot of sense because you don't want to give them the wrong impression that, hey, there's some real trouble
Right.
going on and things of that sort. So could you maybe give me an example even just to how would you frame that communication working with one of your customers?
Yeah, I think that's when you need to have, going back to your earlier point about all the functions, right? So that's where you really, really need to have your salespeople. Depending on the business or the business unit that you are trying to wind down, geography, and then there are specific sales folks who are knowledgeable around that, right, and the customers. So when you're looking at the list of customers that you need to go and talk to, you obviously do some prioritization. I mean, which is normal in any situation, even in M&A, right? You're trying to see, you can't have the same plan, unfortunately, for all your customers. You got to have some kind of segmentation of how you handle your top accounts and what it means to your company, and then from there on, you go down the list and see, you can't have the same message for everyone, basically, right? So the top customers, obviously, you need to give them, I think, as much as white glove service as you can, right? You got to go and unfortunately, in today's world, we can't travel. Not a lot of people can travel. Even salespeople can't travel. I was just reading the other day the impact it's having on the travel industry. But you got to talk to the customer and one-on-one. And as soon as that announcement goes out, you got to bring the customer, I think, in confidence and give them the reason why we are and what's the roadmap. So the transparency, I think, is key, Kisan, right? I think as much as transparent you can be at that point, and then going back, as I said, try and see what you can do. How can you reduce the pain and the transition? If there is a way that you can give them extra product ahead of time, right, so that they have enough time to transition off to another vendor, that may be it. It might be something where you're giving them an incentive, a discount. So you have to work with your customers, but I think it's better that way as opposed to just doing one single email broadcast or putting it on our website and say, hey, this is happening and deal with it, right? So I mean, We
So
don't live in that world
you're
anymore.
pretty transparent. You're basically telling them why you're winding down the business and just being really upfront. Like, hey, this line hasn't worked for us, and so forth. And that's we made this decision. But I'm communicating with you because I want to make sure you're well supported as we make this transition. Does that sound about right?
Yep, I think so. I think so. Transparency, and again, I think the keyword is as transparent as you can, right? So you got to be very, you got to have that, and having the same sales account people, having that discussion with them, I think helps as well, right? So it's as I said, a white glove. You want to then communicate it to the right people within the sales organization, and they will then go to and talk to their account people, right? So that helps as well. Having that relationship built in, this kind of communication better to come from them, and then you have your executive, staff ready if it comes to an escalation, right? Escalations do happen usually, and there are some people or customers who would have a bigger pain than others, and in that case, then that becomes a one-off discussion,
Have you had to
exception,
deal with
right? That
that?
we
Have you
can
had to
do.
deal with some pissed off customers?
Luckily, no, I haven't, or at least it hasn't reached to me yet. But no, luckily, no. Um, yeah, I like to keep it that way.
When it comes to employees, is it a similar approach that you take with customers in terms of providing that as much level of transparency as you can and really keeping that communication and dialogue open to make the transition smooth?
Yeah, the employees, I think a lot of it is to do with, I mean, obviously there is an impact on employees. As I said, when you're winding down or shutting down a specific division or a business unit or what have you within a company, there are going to be employees who have specific skill, which is only applicable to that particular product or a service. So there are going to be implications on the employees for sure. I think what you do in those cases is you got to really, really understand the employees and who are going to be getting impacted. And in some cases, I think we notice that in M&A as well. Sometimes it's a lot of these guys have built this product from ground up. Right? They have that special affinity towards that product to the customers. And it's sometimes it's not even about them. It's not about, okay, what's going to happen to me. It's also beyond that. So you got to have empathy, I think is the right word there. You do have, you plan for the right communication. You go through all the specific steps that are outlined within the legal framework. But then I think empathy is important, and you try and see if you can really alleviate any pain as much as possible in this. Try and see if there are any opportunities inside the company. And I think a lot of companies have really good, good HR and good culture values, right? So that helps, I think. But it's not an easy thing, right? It's unfortunate, but that's what happens sometimes.
Right. So journalists like to make a story into a provoking story. And I'm curious because given the circumstance of winding a business down, when it sort of gets into the media scope, how do you contain that from it being something of more of a realistic nature versus getting blown out of proportion? That hey, ship is sinking, people are getting laid off. You know what I mean? I'm kind of curious
Right,
because sometimes we hear the news, but then it's difficult to know what actually happened. You may sort of get this
right,
impression that there's massive layoff and things are falling apart when the reality isn't as
right.
extreme.
It's a great question. So valid in today's day and age, right? The media is almost sometimes controls the narrative. And I think it's about how do we control the narrative and take the control back ourselves, right? So I think it goes
That's
along
what
with
M&A
having a
science is all
solid.
about. M&A science is all get the truth from the practitioner and learn how they deal happen. So
Exactly, right? So yeah, I think the comms piece I talked earlier about and the PR, both those things, like having a good communication plan, I think is paramount, and especially if you have your quarterly earnings report, I mean, our earning call, if you're a publicly traded company or what have you, right? You usually have a solid comms team or a department, and I think it applies the same. We talked about what we talk to the customers, like whatever content or whatever discussion that we have with the customers. I think it's always probably better to have that ourselves with the media, right? So there is, the press release that we do. I think almost has the narrative in there, and does exactly say why, what we thought, where we are, and why we are doing what we are doing, right? So those if those things are clearly called out, as opposed to, I think the one thing you don't want to do is not do a press release or keep it on the down low and hope that nobody calls you out, right? So that's absolutely something that we had in mind, that we have to really control this. And to be honest, I think if you have a valid case, which in our cases, the projects that I've worked on had them, I think you're okay, as long as you can make that case about it. And what happens, I think it's about time to market, or first to market. I forget what's called, but if you are first to the market about what's going on, then obviously the media is second, and that really doesn't has that same impact. Otherwise, it might have had, right? So I think good call out. I think the PR, it's very, very critical.
So yeah, that's interesting. It sounds like clarity in the why is sort of the best way to ground reality.
Absolutely. I think the why is very, very important, because that's what happens when somebody announces something like this. It's why, what's happening. As you said, the ship is sinking. Oh my God, what's going on? But if you have a very specific why, it's not the ship. It's just one simple element within it, and we have to pivot. We have to course correct, and then we'll be fine. So those kind of things, I think, are very important to be very, very transparent, I think. And so far I've seen it helps, because it just it's the way it is.
You haven't seen a blowout yet.
No, I mean, no, I mean, I haven't. Yeah, I mean, now that you're asking me all these questions, I'm worried. But no, I haven't seen any blowout yet on any of those accounts.
Well, I got
But if
a
it does happen, yeah, it will happen. So.
I got a good question here. How is the wind down measured? What is considered a successful shutdown of a business?
Wow, that's a good question. I think earlier on, when you're sitting down and planning, I think we kind of touched upon it earlier, right? When you're planning and figuring out what are the priorities, what's my long pole in the tent, right? The critical path. That kind of tells you, right? So if you are basically seeing that is the business, let's say, or the business unit is not hitting its revenue target, or the market has shifted and it's only going down from there. So you know why you're doing it, and then how soon do we need to do this based on that critical path item. So as soon as you figure that out, that the minimum, the bare minimum, I need 12 months to shut this down. And if you can match that up with the actual shut or wind down, so if it's going to take you at least 12 months, and if you're able to wind that down in 12 months, I think you did a good job, right? So any time extra that you take on top of it is basically you're bleeding money, if that's the case, or whatever the reason you're winding down, that continues to happen. So I think there is, unfortunately, at least I can't think of any shortcuts, because if you try and take shortcuts, there is always going to be something out there that's going to catch you. But I think that's probably a good metrics of success. I haven't thought about it that way right now, but I'm thinking about it as we speak. But that might be a good way of measuring the success.
So time frame, but then also budget would factor in as well, in terms of, hey, we planned a budget for this wind down, and what does that end up being?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and that's a good point. Budget is for sure. And in one of the examples, as I said, right, we found out something later on which we did not have planned for, so it went over, right? But again, it has to be put in perspective. Had we known earlier, we would have put that in budget anyways.
Right.
So it's not that we have really exceeded the budget, but you're right. The budget is critical. A lot of that, I think you can't be as accurate about it when you get into it. As you start peeling the onion slowly, you get to know the labor laws, you get to know the customer obligations, so on and so forth. You kind of know what it looks like, right? And then you build on it. But that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, cost and time, for sure.
Can you walk me through legal entity planning as part of a wind down? What that looks like?
Yeah, so legal entity depends on the situation, right? So the legal entity we are talking about right now is, let's say, as an example, you acquire a company and you did not merge the legal entity, right? As we know, as part of a mergers and acquisitions, legal entity is one of the biggest parts. One of the last things we do is we say, well, what's my legal entity plan? And you merge the legal entity with the acquiring company, or you keep it because you don't have a legal entity in that specific region or what have you. So in this case, it's exactly the opposite. Now you have to figure out if we have integrated the legal entity or if we have not. If we have not, then I think comes the question about, okay, so what do we need to do? Do we need to keep it? What all the dependencies on the legal entity, right? Usually you have your customers on that, customer contracts on the legal entity. You have your payroll on the legal entity. You have things like your IT on the legal entity. You have manufacturing, all those things on the same legal entity. So as you're planning throughout this, you start figuring out, okay, so what are my dependencies? And slowly but surely, when you hit all those milestones, then I think comes a point where you say, okay, so now what do I need to do with it? Now I don't have any customer contracts. They're all gone. I don't have any payroll on it. I don't have any manufacturing. And what do we do with IP? Do we keep it there? Does it make sense to keep it there? Do we want to move it to somewhere else? So those are the steps, I think. So if you have a good tax team, in most cases, you usually always do, they will also help you walk through the implications one way or another, right? But I think it doesn't stop until you really, I mean, I talked about WPS as the last function to switch off the lights, but legal entity, I think, is a very cross-functional, um, you know, initiative that everybody's involved, finance, tax, everybody, HR. So collectively, then you decide what makes best sense for the company, and then you either dissolve it or you keep it. But that's the important thing down that you got to plan for.
Yeah, it's interesting. It sounds like there's a lot of considerations that go into that, and even some crossover with how you would plan a divestiture.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very similar to the Vestige in that case. Yeah.
What are some tips, best practices you have for somebody that's going to have to go through a wind down?
um, well, I can tell you from my experience. I think it's to really having a solid. I think it all starts with um, the executives really having a good support from the executives, a good clarity on what we're trying to do. Right? It could be the CEO, it could be the president of that business unit, it could be whatever it might be. But whoever is in charge of it, I think it's very important to have that clarity and support, because all we have talked about so far has implications, and that those implications can become a big ball of fire, right? And it can have a big implication on the company itself. So as long as that clarity is there from the top, that's number one. So I think having that, you can't have walk into something like this without having a very good understanding of we really need to do this. So that needs to happen, I think, because at any point if you change that, then it could be a problem. Secondly, once you have that, having a good team assembled, right? Um, because sales really know about their customers, right? Manufacturing folks really know about what can they really manufacture, because in some cases that becomes one of the important criteria for planning this wind down, right? I have to manufacture so and so product. After that, I can shut down. So that becomes critical. So again, I mean, you need to have the right people. I mean, this is nothing new, that it's probably applicable everywhere, but more so in the case of wind down, because I think, as I said, it's very specific project with a specific milestone and timeline. I think those are the two things I would say. Have a very good communication, have good communication lines with the executives, give them updates on a weekly, monthly basis so that they are not caught in the dark. If you need any help, there is no, I mean, go to them right then and then. And if we think we need to pull a plug before we do any announce, then that's probably the better thing than to just go ahead and see what happens, right? So I think having a clear line of communication, having a solid team, I would say, are the other two things. Other than that, you probably are just gonna dive and catch.
Yeah, there's a lot of learning on the go, but it sounds like I heard a couple good themes there around a lot of planning, the legal entity side, the communication, and then getting the right people involved to execute well.
Yeah, yep,
What,
absolutely.
I got to ask, but what's the craziest thing you've seen in M&A?
Yeah, so I think been doing this for a while. I think I want to maybe, if you may, I'm going to answer this a little differently, right? So I think I have lots of anecdotes about crazy things, but I have a feeling probably a lot of them have seen them as well. But a question I have really is about the hit or miss ratio for M&As, right? I mean, why is it? I mean, we all agree. We almost have agreed that okay, it's about 90 to 70%. I think I saw Harvard Business Review study that they found it's about 70 to 90% of acquisitions fail. And I'm a sports buff myself, and I'm thinking, well, if you are a major league batter, major league baseball batter, and if you are batting 100 or you're batting 200, you probably need to go and do something else. You're not going to be playing in a major league team for a long, right? But yet, knowing this, I don't know why we still. I mean, it's a very rhetorical question. It's something that I always wonder, right? We know this, and probably this is a fact for many, many, many years. People have been doing acquisitions, but what do we need to do? Is it maybe the goal that we set for success that needs to be recalibrated? Is it something we need to do differently? The times are changing quickly, or that's the way it is. I don't know. So it's some just food for thought I always have, and I don't know if you have any answers for this, Kisan, from a science perspective. But
We're still learning the science for this on how to improve the success rate of M&A. And it's interesting. I have to post something about it, but it seems like a lot of it does fall apart on the integration side, and everybody can plan as much, but when it comes to really getting that many people involved to execute a high level of change management, that is a big challenge. What have you seen? What do you think are the biggest challenges that hamper deal success?
yeah, I think one of it is probably integration. You're right. I mean, there are so many moving parts, right? And it happens over 12 to 18 months on an average for a larger deal from integration perspective. So there are a lot of things that can go wrong. I'm not disagreeing with you, but also maybe on the deal side too, right? When we are doing a deal and we are creating an ROI, maybe there's something to said there as well, right? So maybe that could be something that we probably need to go back and look at. Was it achievable? Was that the right return on investment that we really thought we should have on this? Right. So there are several factors. I don't know, Kisan. I'm sure there are smart people looking at this all the time, but that's something that I always wonder about. And especially, when you talk about wind down, things when things go down, then unfortunately you have to wind it down because nobody wants to bleed cash on something that's not working. So same thing applies other way around too. When you're acquiring companies, then let's be very careful about the return on investment on it and how it pans out for the employees, for the customers, and everybody across the board. So I don't know what else to say on that, but
Yeah, it sounds like a great
uh,
topic for us to even take some of the findings from these interviews and consolidate. So, that,
I think so. Yeah.
uh, Jeet, I want to thank you so much for spending the time with me and covering a lot of great lessons about how to wind a business line down.
Yeah. Thank you. It was a lot of fun. Thanks talking to you. Nice talking to you, Kisan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Till next time.